welcome everyone to the Carbon and Biodiversity panel. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Nadine Stuber. I'm the Global Insetting and Offsetting Manager at Nestlé. So I work mainly on high-quality nature-based solution projects within our supply chain. And I'm very excited to be here today to talk about carbon and biodiversity during the panel, during which we will focus mainly on the increasing importance of biodiversity in corporate ESG efforts, how we can include more biodiversity in carbon projects such as nature-based solution projects like Karen just mentioned, the need for robust methodologies both in the carbon and the biodiversity market, and how technology can be used both to increase or improve monitoring and also create transparency. And so anyone that is joining us online, please feel free to ask any of your questions in the chat. It will come up and I will try to ask some of them to the panel. And anyone who's here, you can also use the app, or we also have some mics that we can pass around. And of course, we only have 45 minutes, so we'll probably won't be able to get through all of them, but I'll try to do my best to make it as interactive as possible. So without further ado, I'm very excited to learn a little bit more about our great panelists. So why don't you all just shortly introduce yourself? Maybe, Jack, you can start.
Sure. I'm Jack Lonsdale. I'm a principal with A3 Management Consulting. I've been working with clients recently, sort of helping develop strategies and understand better the carbon and biodiversity sort of, landscape and what makes good potential robustly implemented projects, as well as more on the technology side, understanding what's available to assess and validate and measure the changes in both carbon and biodiversity.
My name is Alexandra Holmlund. Can you hear me? My name is Alexandra Holmlund, and I'm currently doing a PhD research on biodiversity credits at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. In my previous life, I was, or I am, a forester, and I have been working with international forestry investments, mostly for institutional clients. And that background is quite helpful when I'm working on designing biodiversity credits structures.
Thank you. So I'm a replacement this morning for Paul Smith, who unfortunately has got flu. But I'm a trustee of Botanic Gardens Conservation International. My name is Stuart Clanahan. I'll be speaking later as well. And for those of you who don't know what Botanic Gardens Conservation International is, we normally refer ourselves as BGCI. We're based in London in the Kew property, but we're separate from Kew. And we represent the world's botanic gardens. We have more than 700 members, and we have more than 60,000 plant scientists, horticulturists, and other experts in our network. We have offices in China, we have an office in Kenya, we have an office in Singapore and in the US as well, so we have a global presence. And our mission really is to prevent the extinction of plant species and to conserve them in the natural habitat. So I'm going to, before going into my longer spiel later on, I'll just leave you with a bit of data, which is that there are roughly 60,000 species of trees in the world. More than a third of those are either endangered or critically endangered. So that's more than 20,000 species of trees. And 440 have less than 50 remaining in the wild. And that is the magnitude of the challenge that I think we all face in terms of addressing biodiversity and species extinction.
Good morning, everybody. Victor Giraldo, and I'm a forestry engineer, and I work as a carbon technical and origination director for nature-based offset in Trafigura. Trafigura is a commodity provider with a global scale and reach, with offices in almost 48 countries. We are as an investors, and we evaluate the possibility to scale up restoration or reforestation programs worldwide.
Great. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you all here. So, Alexandra, you were mentioning that you're working on biodiversity credits. Could you maybe explain a little bit more what exactly a biodiversity credit is and how it's measured? I imagine all of us know what a carbon credit is, where the unit is very defined, but for biodiversity, it's probably a little bit more complicated.
Right. So I can only speak of the credit that, such as I define it within my research. I'm working only with the forestry-based credits, specifically for the Scandinavian conditions. So when I'm speaking of biodiversity, I'm only looking at the type of biodiversity that we normally work with as foresters. In the forestry value chain. So we're looking basically at what is growing at the ground, on the ground level, and assessing the diversity of mostly plants, which will tell us different things about the habitat. So biodiversity credit for me is the net gain of biodiversity over time. So the problem with biodiversity compared to carbon credits is that we are not measuring biodiversity credits in tons. But there is a very complicated way of calculating biodiversity credit units, which we're trying to distribute over time. But it's more complex than just saying, okay, this is a ton of carbon that we have drawn down. Carbon, in comparison to biodiversity, is very simple.
Yes.
So I would say that, yes, indeed.
Yeah.
There's some simplifications on the biodiversity metrics when we try to put it as an offset or as a credit. Some cases in some domestic markets, you try to measure them by hectare, for example. But now, for example, in Australia, with the new potential voluntary national market, they are based on project. And that's a credit per project. It's not per hectare or per acre. So indeed, the measurement of biodiversity net gains, it's based on an area, but that area can be defined according to the specific market requirements. And even though we have species credits, that is a different metric. So that's why biodiversity is a bit more complex than ton of CO2 per hectare per year.
And so many people are already quite skeptical about carbon credits. How would you expect or think would be the best way to use these kind of biodiversity credits, given that it is a little bit more complex and it is much more local than maybe carbon?
Indeed, there are challenges, but we need to start to put biodiversity as a major attribute of ecosystem, not as a descriptive co-benefit of something, because it doesn't allow us to go through valuation. A credit is a pricing exercise. It's not a complete valuation of biodiversity. But of course, we can take the lessons learned from carbon markets through their standards, methodologies, and principles, and of course, to start to analyze which methodologies, specific frameworks, and ways to trade biodiversity can be done. Carbon markets are still evolving, improving their MRB systems, always trying to identify risks of reversals on all these elements that are complicated. Biodiversity is a matrix of indicators. It's not just one. We need to identify for our specific schemes which ones can be measured. So I will say there are enough science behind every indicator that we can evaluate to transform in a net gain. We just need to define the general frameworks, the standard of methodologies that allow us to talk in a similar language, not only at domestic level. Because the ecosystem equivalences, when you work with biodiversity compensations in compliance sectors, are always requesting that you work in a very domestic scheme. But what happens when we want to communicate globally in a voluntary carbon market or in a voluntary biodiversity market? Then this is the time that we can combine both and try to take lessons learned from carbon market as a market mechanism, and as a market mechanism that acts as a driver of investment to enhance biodiversity, but that enhancement, we can measure it and try to put it as a market mechanism as well. That's like the way that we're trying to work with biodiversity and carbon combined.
Sounds very interesting. It sounds like there's a lot to do, but it'd be great to achieve it. Stuart, I think you're working a little bit on standards as well. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about
exactly.
that?
Just trying to simplify things in terms of biodiversity, because it is an extremely complex topic. I don't think it's going to have the similar solution that we found to the carbon markets. It's not as easy to measure as carbon as a metric. I think we look at biodiversity and divide it into two. One is what I've explained already, which is that we're seeing species loss. And of course, the number of species at risk in the world is around about 1 million. And as I said already, about 20,000 of those are trees. Now, if you protect a tree in the wild, then it's actually home to lots of other things as well. So if you lose a tree, you lose many other species. So we can identify species which are more important, if you like, to protect, because they have a more dramatic impact on other wildlife as well. The second side of biodiversity, which is partly related to the first, is actually what I would call ecosystem or habitat conservation. And this is where systems become resilient because they are somewhat imbalanced. Nature, of course, is never balanced. That's why evolution happens. But somewhat imbalanced, and they provide the ecosystem services that we all recognize that we need. And that's everything from soil stability to climate moderation and other services as well. What we're seeing, unfortunately, today is that people, I believe, certainly haven't overreacted to climate change, but they've defaulted to plant a tree anywhere because it's going to do good. And we are seeing perfectly stable, incredibly important habitats destroyed to plant trees. So at BGCI, our message to the world is this, which is, first of all, building on our many decades of working particularly in tree conservation. We would say, make sure that you plant native species of trees in the countries in which you're planting. Make sure that you plant diverse species of trees. Make sure that you conserve habitats ahead of planting trees. So in other words, don't destroy that nice grassland to plant trees on it. And we've come up with, together with Q and other collaborators, 10 golden rules of tree planting, which is, you can just look it up. It's available and it's been published, and a lot of people got hold of that. Now, a lot of knowledge on tree planting and on how ecosystems work is local in nature. And because we are a global network, we have representations and members in more than 100 countries around the world. We're looking through our global biodiversity standard, which is under development right now, to engage local practitioners in actually measuring global, whether a project is good or not in terms of biodiversity. So that we have a pilot studies under development right now in 6 countries, in Peru, in Brazil, Kenya, Uganda, Madagascar, and India. And we'll be adding later more as well. And the objective is really, if you're tree planting in those countries, we can provide you with local expertise to tell you about your biodiversity impact, negative or positive, and also help you find the right expertise, horticultural expertise, to plant trees. So we're really joining up the demand which we know exists between the corporate world and the financial world and practitioners on the ground. And I think that's really that big gap in the middle which we need to be focusing on, which includes, of course, pricing and trading. I wouldn't say biodiversity credit. I don't like that myself, or offsets, certainly not. But I think we need to find a way of interacting people who have a problem with biodiversity with those practitioners.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And there are already some standards that exist. For example, if you have carbon credits and you have the CCB, how do you think biodiversity credits or your standards are additional to what already exists today? Anyone who would like to go?
So, you know, the carbon markets included biodiversity, at least very into the VCS and plus CCV certification. CCV is Climate, Community, and Biodiversity Standard. When you can add biodiversity as a descriptive co-benefit linked to your carbon project, I think this is a good start for identifying biodiversity as an important element of projects into carbon standard. But we need to go beyond that, where CCV is a good starting point to measure some indicators. But it's not yet defined that measuring or describing biodiversity through these carbon projects can increase even the price of the carbon credit, because there is not a proper valuation of biodiversity into that process. It's a good start, but definitely carbon markets as a driver of investment in biodiversity, at least the forestry, into forestry project, nature-based ones, with native species or with a strong environmental additionality, it's okay. But in carbon markets, they only like a step right now in that process is CCV, but CCV needs to be improved to a proper valuation of biodiversity, at least a pricing exercise. So how much costs you to develop an enhancement in biodiversity? Part of it, it's the cost of the restoration process itself, for example, but what else? That's the part that is still missing, but of course there are lessons learned, good science behind CCV standard, but we need to go beyond that.
I would like to believe that not everything is about carbon. No, I have nothing against carbon at all. I'm just thinking that let's say, in European context, where we are not planting trees to sequester carbon in general, we are having a forest industry that is depending on the fiber that we produce. We certainly have a biodiversity problem in our forestry systems. But we also need to produce the fiber. I mean, still we want to have paper and wooden chairs and whatnot. So how do we incentivize forest owners, be it companies or private, to do something about biodiversity? This is what has triggered me to look at the biodiversity credit as a possible instrument to enable flows of finance to actually finance the actions towards improved biodiversity. And that can be anything from allowing for more mix of broadleaf species in a conifer monoculture, basically what we have in Scandinavia, or it can be different restoration actions that a forest owner definitely would never do if nobody paid for it. But it is so important that we do certain actions, because we will definitely lose a lot of important habitats. So for me, I see this necessity, I see this need for financing, and also a need to address it properly in a separate instrument than carbon credit, that will allow for let's say specific reporting on biodiversity aspects that are separate from carbon sequestration. And let's put it like this: it is biodiversity, it is the existence of biodiverse ecosystems that is actually the prerequisite for carbon sequestration.
Indeed.
And I think you touched upon a really interesting point there regarding the measurement of biodiversity and how to monitor this. And I think, Jack, you were going to discuss this a little bit on how to potentially use technology and how this could be used going forward.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people here that are going to talk more about it later on, but I think there's already kind of ways that we can start thinking about the measurement of biodiversity from measurements that are being taken already in forests through standard inventory procedure and things like that, and building up a kind of proxy index of biodiversity based on those measurements. And we've been working with our colleagues in A3X on looking at how in the Finnish context that could be done to use kind of machine learning and the existing measurements to drive an index that maybe starts to indicate, or at least indicate, the changes that are being made with biodiversity. I don't think it's the full answer, and I think in reality there's always going to have to be someone on the ground looking at these things, because that validation and verification is so important. We already see it with carbon, that people are dubious perhaps of what's going on the ground. When you talk about like satellite measurements and things like that. So it is important, but I think we need to have a way that can consider holistically the landscape scale, what's going on.
If I can just pick up on that point on the ground, this is really where BGCI feels it can add something to biodiversity conservation and restoration as well, because of course our network of gardens, 700 or more, are around the world. And actually when you go to these gardens, what you'll find is there'll be a drawer somewhere with maps, vegetation maps and other maps, which maybe have been created 60, 70, 80 years ago, but are clearly not very accessible to anyone with a modern technology solution. So it's actually what I think we have to do here is the following, which is I think we have to engage local practitioners. There is a lot of data around, and in fact, there's a lot of embedded biodiversity loss in all the products that we use today. And if you buy a biscuit or a bar of soap, and of course it's made with palm oil, that palm oil is produced from a plantation which may be 60 years old. The question will be to the deforestation-free supply chain that you think you've bought into is what was there before, and actually what has been put at risk and was embedded in our existing supply chains today. The answer actually lies in those dusty drawers. So actually part of BGCI is we are looking to open those drawers to work with technology companies to unlock the huge amounts of really good information on biodiversity and species distribution so that we can actually start to solve these questions and actually answer the question is, I'm a responsible corporation or I'm a responsible bank, what should I do to solve this problem? And that's where we want to get to on this.
And I think that's also very interesting from a consumer point of view to get that information, understand that how this could be impacted. I don't know if we have any questions from the audience. Yes. Yes, there's a microphone in the back, sorry.
Yes. Christelle Verroes from NG. I've got a series of questions related to the comments that were made in terms of biodiversity and what is important. You mentioned the fact that it was important to establish native species when you develop projects. We know that climate change is affecting the forestry systems, that maybe native species are no more adapted. So I would like just to have your point of view on that and whether it's a recommendation that is globally applicable. And on the diversity of species, we noticed that most of the carbon projects, they will really bet on fast-growing species. So I was wondering whether good practices could also encompass the fact that it might not be compatible with carbon markets.
I'll pick up on the first question, if I may, which is why are species disappearing? And you're right, actually, in some circumstances, climate change has happened to change the local weather systems, and the trees or other plants that grow there simply can't survive anymore. But by far the majority of endangered species of trees are actually endangered because of human actions, and this is over-harvesting, it's collecting of, there's a great example in Malawi, for example, the Malanje cedar, which is actually the national tree of Malawi, which grew on the Malanje mountain, got down to 17 species in the wild. That's not due to climate change, that's due to people over-harvesting them. It's a fantastic wood, termites don't eat it, and you can make buildings out of it, and the locals just used it for construction. Now we, at the cost of $350,000, worked with a team of both local and international conservationists, and over the last 5 years, more than 500,000 Malanje cedars have been planted. And there's now a little cottage industry in Malawi of people making a living from growing Malanje cedar saplings. So I think we can use climate as an excuse for, well, that species was going to go and it's just tough. But actually there's a lot we can do to protect these species, and who knows what the future value of any species of plant or animal is.
Yeah, we talk as a forester. I'm a forestry engineer. And based on our experience on different type of projects, the first thing is in carbon markets, we also talk about nature-based solutions. And there is a broader spectrum of different type of projects that you can implement at landscape level to generate ecosystem services linked to market mechanisms, which means carbon in this case as a carbon credits. Why not biodiversity as a biodiversity credit in the future, and why not future water credits or something like that. So there are monoculture restoration, reforestation projects, but also native species, but also mixed species, and also strategic ecosystem projects like mangroves restoration or paramos in Andean regions that are the areas where water is originated. So there is a broader spectrum. Regarding restoration or monocultures, when we talk about restoration or reforestation, we need to take in soils. How degraded is the soil or the land where we are planning to develop a project? There are soils or lands where almost nothing is growing because it's completely degraded. Native species cannot grow because their original conditions were lost. So you need to start the regeneration process applying or using non-native species in some cases in order to create the proper conditions that allows you to put in the future native species. So a proper combination of these elements allows you to develop different types of projects through time. So not having a monoculture, not necessarily, but even under these scenarios of fully degraded soils, almost no soil, you can do combination of different natives or non-native species. In the end, the implementation of these projects will generate ecosystem services or enhancements compared to a baseline where you didn't have anything, like nothing were growing. Then if you're developing non-native species initial restoration process that you can combine with native species, you are absorbing CO2, you are increasing the biodiversity. So the idea is to play with it in a landscape with the logic of what you have. Not in all cases apply to have native species, not in all cases is good to have a monoculture. But in that spectrum, we can understand what we can do and to which market we can apply these enhancements that we are creating. In some cases, carbon as a driver of investment to enhance biodiversity, and why not, in other cases, biodiversity as the main target, as a biodiverse restoration process that can also sequester carbon.
Can I add a comment there? I think one other aspect, of course, and probably the biggest kind of argument for biodiversity credits or the financing mechanism for that is, how has it been that monocultures have become the norm for reforestation projects? Is because, there are industries that take that wood and use it, and if you don't have that offtake, then there's no income from that. So you need to have either funding or the example that you gave, Paul, was very good of like developing something native. But if you don't have that offtake, then how do you develop something without the finance behind it? So biodiversity could provide that extra income. At the moment, carbon credit income is still marginal for most developments, and it's difficult to develop a project purely on the carbon income. If the biodiversity credits can push things over the cost boundary, then that's important.
Stuart, you were saying before that you're not a big fan of carbon credits. Do you see...
Oh, I'm a fan of carbon credits.
Of biodiversity credits, sorry, and biodiversity offsets. Do you see a different way to incentivize landholders or also...
Yeah, I think the fundamental problem is that we want many things out of the same patch of land. So, for example, we want the ecosystem services, we want the biodiversity, we want fiber, we want food, we want leisure time, etc., out of the same land. And you're absolutely right that it's very difficult in some instances to compare fast-growing, high-yielding trees like eucalyptus with maybe a carbon yield. But we have seen in carbon markets an increase in price recently, and certainly a differentiation for removals over avoided projects. And today, I would guesstimate, and I'm going to look at Paul here, $15 to $20 a ton for high-quality carbon removals from a nature-based project. Now, what is a high-quality project? Well, a project that's high quality has elements of biodiversity protection in it and conservation. And if you look at a tropical country, you'll probably get a sequestration rate of in the order of 20 to 25 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent a hectare a year. right? So multiply that by 20, that's $500 worth of revenue per hectare a year, and that accumulates over time. So you don't have to harvest that crop. So it's not an uncompelling argument to actually invest in biodiverse restoration, if you like. And there's large areas of land in some countries too. Like even Brazil has claimed that it's going to restore 8 million hectares under its NDC of its land. There's lots and lots of opportunities out there, I think, for nature-based restoration, which can sit alongside maybe productive land for other uses.
Perfect. Great. Do you have any other questions? Yes. I think the mic is, yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much to the panelists for a stimulating discussion. My name is Sepul Baru. I work as a senior consultant in a Finland-based consultancy called Indofor. My background is in forestry and climate change economics. I wanted to point out two market-based biodiversity conservation mechanisms from Finland that I am aware of. One is called biodiversity offsetting. It works a little bit like carbon crediting, the large forest owner setting aside part of land on behalf of somebody else. So that is one. And then idea is that, this continuous parcel of land put together, because, in biodiversity, if you conserve small pieces of land here and there, it doesn't work really. So you have to have a large enough pieces of land. So that is one. The other one is even more tangible through FSC certification. When someone sells the wood, then if you set aside, say, at least 10% of your land, you do nothing, just conserve it, and then harvest in the other, then you can get biodiversity credit, like, the price premium, on top of your timber price. So these are not perfect solution, but at least, there is something. But then again, one query or question really is that, when we are talking about biodiversity, our metrics is like, how many hectares we are really conserving. But, when we are talking about biodiversity, is the species and genetic diversity and that kind of thing. I myself am a forester. Like, we did, like, Shannon-Weber index, measured all those things, diversity, species diversity. We measured a lot. I mean, this. So whether, my question to the panelists is that whether, you see an opportunity to integrate that kind of thing, even like, creating a metrics, like, Shannon-Weber index that, we have been using it for many, many years. So whether that can be one way to measure the biodiversity and credit it, instead of, going at the top level, at the hectare level. Thank you so much.
Who would like to go with that question?
It's kind of...
I was looking at it. Well, I would maybe not answer your question, but I'd like to comment on a few things, if I may. All us being foresters here, I've been working operationally in Scandinavian forestry for, I don't know, over 20 years. Regarding FSC certification, it's a great thing that we have an FSC certification. It has certainly done a very good thing. However, I would like to point out that in my view, FSC certification and indeed PFC or any other certification is nothing else but a certification of a sustainable forest management. It is not a certification for net gain of biodiversity. It does not account for not well enough on how biodiversity is being treated. And this is why, particularly in the Nordic countries, it has been criticized. So that's why I keep talking about the need to address biodiversity specifically. Yeah, that's the only thing.
And it's true, even in CCB, they'll ask you a lot about biodiversity, but they won't get to the nub of the issue. And they look for proxies. So this is one of the reasons why, of course, we're developing the Global Biodiversity Standard. This is working with local collaborators around the world, and actually will be measuring up people's tree planting or forest restoration against the 10 golden principles. Have you destroyed land to put this in here? Are you using native species and so forth as well? So I think there's a real need for this, and Global Biodiversity Standard, which will be ready next year, is part of the solution. But of course, there's many, many, many aspects too, including much better data. We'll hear about it later today, but the use of technologies to report and so forth, and the development of a good transactional mechanism in the marketplace. And what the transaction needs to be is between people who know they have a biodiversity issue. Often they don't know what it is. There's a very interesting study which came out in April this year from Oxford University. They looked at all of their supply chains across the laboratories, the accommodation, the travel, and so forth. And they figured out they're responsible for 1.5 species loss a year. Which ones? Don't know. So if we can find a mechanism that can link up organizations that have an issue with the most effective conservation of species, for example, or ecosystems, which is related but different, then I think we start to have the basis of a market for transactional mechanisms.
I think you talk about 2 different types of credits based on experiences in domestic credits biodiversity markets in the world, like Australia, United States, and Colombia, and other like transitional domestic markets where there are some regulations around that. For the specific species credits, just again, it's not a valuation, a proper economic valuation of biodiversity. It's an attribute of the ecosystem or an ecosystem service, but it's the pricing exercise of how much it costs you to keep a specific umbrella, for example, umbrella species alive. Then that pricing exercise is a combination of how much it costs you to keep the ecosystem where its species it's flowing, to monitor the species, and to manage the strategies. That's how species credits operates. You mentioned frameworks, FCC, CCV. Indeed, they have some kind of descriptive biodiversity metrics that allows you to have an idea as a proxy information of what is going on there, but they need to be improved. They need to go beyond that. They need to go to a proper, specific monitoring of enhancements, the net gain per se, and quantify how much it costs you to get that net gain. Then maybe we can start to take in the exercise of credits or offset, depending on the name. But definitely we need that. Customers started to request not only forestry as a nature climate solutions for emission reductions, but now they are interested in understanding what is going on with biodiversity. These frameworks are interesting because they provide an initial proxy information about it, but definitely we need to go beyond that and go to specific biodiversity credit or offset markets, or at least ways to value that and allows transactions to use biodiversity also as a driver of investment. Now, right now, we are in a scenario where carbon is a driver of investment for biodiversity, but we need to go to the next stage. And all these mechanisms, starting from species, maybe ecosystem credits like connectivity, allows you to understand that. All of them generates the complexity of a biodiversity market, but there are initial steps to finally have some kind of market global mechanism around biodiversity itself.
Yeah, so I think from this panel it's become very clear that there's definitely already some frameworks around that include biodiversity, but there is a need to really focus or develop something more specific that allows companies, organizations to really measure biodiversity and also incentivize them to not only look at projects from a carbon point of view, but really make biodiversity an aspect as well, to make more holistic projects that combine both. We only have a few more minutes left, so do you have any closing remarks that you would like to share with the audience here today and online as well?
Well, I would like to address the offsets versus biodiversity credits. I think it's important to be clear what is what. When we talk about offsets, we talk about something has been destroyed and then we have to repair it. What I'm looking at regarding biodiversity credits is that we don't have to destroy things first to make them better. Let's just make them better. This is what we're looking for. Yeah.
I 100% agree with that.
Yeah.
This is why I don't like offset. I wouldn't use offset in a biodiversity sense. I think I just intellectually don't get it. Destroy one species and survive. Doesn't work for me. So the good news, I think, is that there is a lot of expertise globally And it's not making itself heard. It exists today in botanic gardens and other research institutes in every country in the world. And actually, the real task for us, I think, is to use that expertise and bring it to the attention of people who've got the money to spend and the problem to solve on biodiversity. And I think we can get that done.
Yeah.
I think
Agree.
I would go further and expand this even further to this kind of question of education and understanding, and Karen talking about a Rosetta Stone for things. Probably even the four of us have different understanding of the topic ourselves, and you just look at what's happening with the carbon market, and there's complete misunderstandings and difficulties in understanding that. So moving that to the further complexity of biodiversity is a big task that needs to be addressed, I think, overall, and that's kind of my takeaway, I think.
And finally, I will say we are all aware there is a twin crisis. There is a climate change and biodiversity loss. And definitely we need to drive investment to address both challenges. In some cases, we can use carbon market as a driver of investment to enhance biodiversity and vice versa. The idea is to understand that in a landscape level approach, both elements need to coexist because they are naturally linked. And that's the idea that we need to have in mind to promote also carbon markets connected to biodiversity ones.
Great. Well, I would like to thank first the panelists for having been here and having shared your wisdom. It's been very interesting, and also the audience, both here today and also online. Thank you very much.